Hey y'all, it's Heel Heat time.
Hi everybody, and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and this is a Heel Heat Top 10. Now the topic of this Top 10, Top 10 ECW Feuds. Now we're only going to regulate this to the original ECW, not the crappy Vince McMahon WWE rerun, or remake, or whatever you want to call it. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. Number 10, the WWF / USWA, headlined by Jerry the King Lawler, versus ECW, headlined by Tommy Dreamer feud. Basically, you had three wrestling promotions wrapped up in one feud. Dreamer and Taz and several other guys went on Raw with Paul Heyman, started a feud, started animosity with them and Jerry Lawler, which carried out on WWF television, USWA television, and ECW television. Even to the fact that at the end of another feud that we're going to talk about later, when that was finally over, Dreamer standing there looking victorious for once in his life, gets laid out and destroyed by Jim Cornette and Jerry Lawler representing the WWF. Also had Rob Van Dam on their side. Just the complexity of them working. The USWA guys were heels in ECW, the ECW guys being heels in USWA. It was just an interesting and fun time to see these things in an era where the promotions didn't really cross-mingle or go with each other much. This was revolutionary and interesting to have an interpromotional feud as such. Now, our number 9 is what a lot of people have said, and what I've heard from a lot of wrestling fans, is the feud that got them to watch ECW, and that was Axel Rotten versus Ian Rotten, the Battle of the Bad Breed, which culminates in the Taipei Death Match, one of the most legendary ECW matches of all time. Another thing, they get split up in a tag team match where the losing team has to split and never tag again. They proceed to go on a violent feud, set the tone for some of the violence that would come down the line from ECW, set an early example of what to expect. Again, like I said, drew a lot of people in. People would see their pictures in the after mags, knew the Bad Breed from Global Wrestling, from WCW, and from what they did in ECW, and kind of drew them in, and once they got drawn in, they stayed. Number 8. A feud that actually spans more than ECW. It also goes through FMW. Now it would be Masato Tanaka versus Mike Awesome. The guys, no matter what you did, no matter what setting you put them in, if you put the two of them against each other, they delivered awesome, hard-hitting, violent matches. I mean, they literally looked like they were trying to murder each other every time they jumped in the ring. It was kind of came in, again, it was at a time when ECW started losing a lot of talent to the WWE and WCW, and they were starting to look for new guys to take the places of guys like Taz and Raven and Perry Saturn, who had left. And now you got these guys, Tanaka and Awesome, coming over and kind of filling those roles and doing a very admirable job at it. Now our number 7 is the Dudley clan: Devon, Bubba Ray, Sign Guy, Big Dick, and Joel Gertner versus Tommy Dreamer, the Sandman, and Spike Dudley, the Run of the Litter. Kind of mostly went out through brawls. They would have different variations: Dreamer and Sandman versus Devon and Bubba, Big Dick versus Spike, Bubba versus Spike, Sandman versus Devon. All kinds of mixtures of the three, basically two factions fighting each other at one point. Highlights of it would be Beulah getting her neck broken by the Dudleys so she could take time off from wrestling. Kind of just another one of those violent blood feuds that just had fun, just had some of the great characters in ECW history. Just a fun, violent feud. Now, speaking of violence, our number 6 amped up the level of violence and amped up the level of reality in ECW. Shane Douglas versus the Pitbulls. Mostly, the iconic memory from the feud is Shane grabbing Pitbull number 1, Gary Wolf, by his halo from having a broken neck, done by Shane Douglas, and shaking him around the ring, bringing out Pitbull 2, leading the matches with Shane and Pitbull 2. Francine at this point was a manager of the Pitbulls, turns and becomes a head cheerleader for Douglas. Just a compelling storyline that really showed how ruthless Shane Douglas was, showed what kind of a person he really could be, just kept him and propelled him to even higher standings than where he was before that, where at that point he was already someone that was looked at as an ECW legend. This put him in an area where he was not only an ECW legend, but he was willing to do absolutely anything to get ahead. Speaking of getting ahead, number 5, our man Taz versus Shane Douglas. A feud based on the fact that Taz wanted to be the man in ECW, and Shane Douglas was the man in ECW. Come together, put in a couple fantastic matches. Taz chased down Shane Douglas for the better part of a year, had to fight the Triple Threat, had to fight Bam Bam Bigelow, Chris Candido. Even at one point, Taz recruits his enemy Sabu to help him in the feud with the Triple Threat, and Rob Van Dam, of course, as well. All in an effort for Taz to reach the goal that he wanted most, to get the World Championship. Which, I must say, I was there live for. It was an amazing moment. Great feud, great fun during it. Just another example of how ECW and how their storylines carried feuds on. Now, our number 4 feud is Raven versus Sandman. You knew Raven would come in here at some point. This was psychological warfare. You had Raven turning Sandman's child against him, turning Sandman's ex-wife against him, Sandman fighting for the forces of good. The feud that led to the most controversial part of ECW history, that would be the crucifixion of Sandman. Such a controversial moment, even controversial to this day. The two guys went out there, just put on fantastic brawls with each other, fought back and forth for the world title. Just an example of what can be done just using your brain. And that was Raven's thing. He could use his brain to manipulate everything around him. Now, our number 3 feud is probably the feud that put the most classic matches of any of the feuds on in ECW history, and that's Rob Van Dam versus Jerry Lynn. Basically, just the 2 best wrestlers in the company going out and innovating and putting on matches for the ages, matches that you go back 15, 20 years almost later, and they still stand the test of time, and they're still fantastic, and they still are innovative. And these guys did counters on top of counters. What they would do in one match, they would start to do in the next match, and it would be countered. Then the match after that, that counter would be countered. Then the next match, that counter of the counter of the counter of the original move would be countered. And they just kept building and building and putting on these insane matches that have to go down in history as some of the great matches in all of wrestling history. Just a fantastic display of 2 elite level athletic talents in wrestling. Rob Van Dam at the absolute peak of his career, Jerry Lynn at the absolute peak of his career, colliding, putting on classics for probably about a 2-year run. It was just a fantastic, wonderful time to be a fan of wrestling and a fan of these two. Speaking of two, our number 2 feud, Sabu versus Taz. This is the feud that the first ECW pay-per-view is built on. Taz wanting to get at Sabu, wanting to fight his rival, his enemy. For a year, Taz tried to get to Sabu and couldn't. Much like Taz versus Shane Douglas, this was a bitter feud, fought on one end. They finally go after each other, lights go out. It just, the way everything worked out, the way that Taz and Sabu came together, Sabu, I mean, the whole thing was fantastic. Their match was fantastic. Had Alfonso turning on Taz to join Sabu after the match. It was just, everything about it I enjoyed. Thoroughly fun. A great way to show how you build a feud. Now, before we get to our number 1, we're going to do a little thing here. If you've seen our top 10s before, you know what's coming up. But for those of you who didn't, I'm going to explain it to you. It's called the best of the rest. Basically, the things that barely missed our top 10 list. The number 1, or in no particular order, the Eliminators versus the Dudley Boys. I thought this was some classic tag team action. You had the Eliminators, who were the best tag team in ECW for a little while, kind of passing the torch to the Dudley Boys, who then became the best tag team in the history of wrestling, in my opinion. Some awesome feuds, some fun matches with each other. Probably would have made the list if it lasted a little bit longer, in my opinion. Unfortunately, a little bit crunched for time in the feud. The Perry Saturn had left to go to WCW. But a great feud nonetheless. Next up, a feud from before the time that most people watched ECW, Tommy Cairo versus Sandman. The feud that took the Sandman from the surfer guy that would wear a bodysuit to the ring into the Zubaz wearing, beer drinking, smoking, cane swinging Sandman we all know and love. A little bit of back on it, Tommy Cairo takes Sandman's wife at the time, Peaches. The whole thing, it drew into, it just went from there and then morphed into Tommy Dreamer getting involved. The whole thing was fun, the whole thing was great. It's something that I recommend going back and looking at. It's part of ECW history that even a lot of ECW fans haven't went back and watched. It was before ECW really made the nationwide buzz that they would get. This was when ECW was really more of a regional thing before it blew up. But it was still a fun feud, still an interesting way to get Sandman. You see the evolution of the character that would become one of the icons of ECW during the feud. And last but not least, on our best of the rest, Yoshihiro Tajiri versus Super Crazy versus Little Guido. A feud that went on for the better part of the year. Different combinations of the two, either Tajiri versus Guido, Crazy versus Guido, or all three together. Put on fantastic, classic matches. Tore down the roof, tore down buildings everywhere they went. Started off as Tajiri versus Super Crazy. Guido gets involved into the feud, gets sucked right in. They continue to put on great matches, great fun wrestling. All in all, just a fun time to be a fan to watch these guys. And another one that I just thought of now, wasn't really a feud, but I knew that if I didn't include this, thinking this down, that people would ask about it. Dean Malenko versus Eddie Guerrero. The series of matches that they put on, bar none, are some of the top matches in wrestling history. Along the lines of RVD and Jerry Lynn, these matches you could put in a time capsule to show people what wrestling is about. And 100 years from now, 200 years from now, They can look at it and understand exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, and exactly who Malenko and Guerrero were. The only reason it didn't make this list is it didn't have the longevity of a lot of these feuds, and it also didn't have the hatred of a lot of these feuds, which is a lot of what goes into what a feud is. If you just have competitive matches, it's not really a feud. If you add the hatred part in, it's what ties it. Now, before we go on to our number one, if you think we've ranked something too high, left something too low, put something off the list altogether. Let us know what you think. Hit us up on Facebook, hit us up on Twitter. Put it down where? Down there in the comments. And make sure to hit like and share and all that other good stuff too while you're at it. Coming from that, our number one feud in the history of ECW should not be no surprise to anybody that's followed me for a long time. My favorite feud of all time, Tommy Dreamer versus Raven. I think the absolute apex of storytelling and professional wrestling is Tommy Dreamer versus Raven. For 2 whole years, Tommy Dreamer could not beat Raven. For 2 whole years, Raven always had the upper hand. He would bring in the Dudleys, the Pitbulls, Blue Meanie, Stevie Richards, Brian Lee. I mean, the cast of characters that came out of the feud was enough to fill the promotion, let alone the feud itself. I mean, just the way everything went. Beulah McGillicuddy, Kimona Wanalea, Beulah's pregnancy, Beulah and Kimona being an item. Tommy taking Beulah from Raven. Raven bringing Beulah, who was the fat girl in school that Tommy didn't pay attention to, when Tommy was the jock and Raven was the outsider in summer camp. Just there's so many layers. The Cactus Jack stuff, where Raven got to Cactus Jack and Cactus Jack was turned against hardcore for a little bit. The Terry Funk helping Tommy Dreamer, his protege. I mean, everything about it was such perfection. Then it all comes together when Tommy finally gets a win, starts to celebrate, and that's what started the USWA ECW feud, was after that match. Just a great match, just great execution, flawless storytelling. In my opinion, the best story that professional wrestling's ever told. But basically, that's what I have for this top 10. My name is George Coles, and you've been watching another Heel Heat Top 10.